They say time heals all wounds, but that is a gentle lie told to comfort the grieving. For some wounds, time doesn't heal. It preserves the pain in amber, sharpening every memory, honing every bitter feeling into a weapon, and it waits, with infinite patience, for the perfect moment to strike. For Amelia, sitting in the heart of the cold, opulent Vance mansion, time had just begun its cruel work. The rain fell outside, not in a soft patter, but in angry, relentless sheets, as if the sky itself was weeping for the betrayal unfolding within those walls. Across the vast, polished mahogany table sat Eleanor Vance, a matriarch carved from ice and ambition, her posture as unyielding as her will. Beside her, slumped in a velvet armchair that seemed to swallow him whole, was Thomas, the man Amelia called her husband. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his silence a deafening roar of cowardice. Between them lay the source of the evening's devastation, a stack of papers, pristine and white against the dark wood. The words, "divorce petition," were printed clinically at the top. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion, cutting through the heavy silence like a shard of glass. "It is a simple matter, Amelia. The Vance name requires an heir. It has been 3 years, and you have failed to provide one. This union is no longer viable." Each word was a calculated blow, designed to strip Amelia of her worth, to reduce her to a single, failed function. Amelia's world tilted on its axis. The warmth of the crackling fireplace couldn't reach the profound chill that had settled deep in her bones. She looked at Thomas, her heart pleading with him to look up, to say something, to deny this nightmare. He had once promised her a lifetime of protection from this very woman, from this very cruelty. But the man she loved was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out stranger who couldn't even meet her gaze. The love she thought was the foundation of her life was revealed to be nothing but sand, and the tide was now washing it all away, leaving her stranded and utterly alone. In that moment, amidst the wreckage of her marriage, a quiet, cold resolve began to form in the deepest part of her soul. They would not break her, they would only make her stronger. To understand the depth of the wound, you must first understand the beauty of what was lost. Before the rain-swept night of the divorce, there were years of sunshine, years when Amelia believed she had found her forever. Her life hadn't been one of privilege and expectation like the Vances. She was the daughter of a history professor and a librarian, raised in a home overflowing with books, not bonds and stocks. Her inheritance was a sharp mind, a creative spirit, and an unshakable belief in the power of hard work. She was an architect, a creator of spaces, someone who saw the soul in a building's design. It was this passion that led her to Thomas. She wasn't looking for a prince, but she found one in the quiet corner of a modern art gallery. He wasn't there as a patron, but as someone genuinely captivated by a chaotic sculpture of twisted metal. She had explained its architectural merits, and he had listened, not with the polite disinterest of the wealthy, but with an intense curiosity that she found intoxicating. Thomas Vance, heir to the Vance Corporation, was charmed not by her name or connections, but by the fire in her eyes when she spoke about blueprints and load-bearing walls. Their courtship was a whirlwind of stolen moments and genuine discovery. He showed her his world of galas and boardrooms, and she showed him hers, a world of dusty workshops, the smell of fresh coffee in a neighborhood cafe, and the simple joy of watching a sunset from a half-finished building. He confessed that her world felt more real, more substantial than his own. He was in love with her perspective, with the way she saw beauty and potential where others saw only empty space. And Amelia, she fell for the man she believed Thomas to be, kind, attentive, and strong enough to exist outside the shadow of his family name. The first time she met Eleanor Vance, however, was the first time she felt a chill in that sunshine. The meeting took place at the Vance estate, a place so grand it felt more like a museum than a home. Eleanor greeted her with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. She appraised Amelia from head to toe, her gaze lingering for a moment too long on Amelia's simple, elegant dress, a dress that was tasteful, but clearly not couture. Eleanor's disapproval was an art form, rarely expressed in outright insults, but woven into the fabric of every conversation. She would offer backhanded compliments, like, "It's so refreshing that you have a career, dear," It must keep you so busy. She spoke of family traditions, of bloodlines, of summering in the Hamptons and wintering in Aspen, all subtle reminders that Amelia was not one of them. She was an outsider, a temporary amusement for her son. Amelia saw the red flags, but Thomas was her shield. "She's from a different generation, darling," he would say, wrapping his arms around her. "She just needs time to see you for who you are. I'll protect you. I'll always be the wall between you and her." Amelia believed him. She loved him enough to believe him. And so, they married, in a ceremony that was more a Vance corporate event than a celebration of love. Despite the grandeur and the cold scrutiny of Eleanor's guests, Amelia focused only on Thomas, and in his eyes, she saw the promise of their future, a future they would build together. For the first 2 years, that promise held true. Their life together was an oasis of warmth and laughter within the cold walls of the estate. Thomas encouraged her to set up a studio in one of the guest houses, and he would spend hours there, watching her work, fascinated by her talent. They traveled, they dreamed, and they loved with a passion that felt invincible. Amelia slowly began to believe that she could win Eleanor over, not by changing who she was, but by simply being the loving, devoted wife her son had chosen. She tried. She hosted dinners, she remembered birthdays, she inquired about Eleanor's charity committees. But every effort was met with that same polite, impenetrable wall of ice. The interference continued, disguised as motherly concern. Eleanor would send over decorators to freshen up rooms Amelia had just finished designing, replacing her personal touches with impersonal, cold luxury. She would buy Amelia wardrobes full of designer clothes, subtly implying that Amelia's own taste was inadequate for a Vance. The first significant crack in Amelia's shield appeared during their second anniversary dinner. They were hosting a small, intimate gathering with some of the Vances' oldest family friends. Amelia was telling a fond story about her father, a man who would spend his meager salary on rare books instead of new shoes. She told it with love and humor, but Eleanor seized the moment. "How quaint," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the quiet table. "It's remarkable what one can achieve from such humble beginnings. You must be so proud, Amelia, to have come so far." The table fell silent. The words were not an attack, but a public branding, a reminder to everyone present that Amelia was, and always would be, an outsider who got lucky. Amelia's face burned with humiliation. She looked to Thomas, expecting him to leap to her defense, to gently reprimand his mother for her cruelty. But he did nothing. He merely offered a tight, uncomfortable smile and changed the subject. Later that night, when she confronted him, his response was the first nail in the coffin of their love. "Darling, just let it go. You know how she island making a scene would have just made it worse." He wasn't her wall anymore. He was a mediator, a peacekeeper, and in his quest for peace, he had sacrificed hers. From that day on, Amelia began to feel a profound sense of unease. The man who had promised to protect her was slowly, almost imperceptibly, choosing his mother's comfort over her own. The foundation of their love, which she thought was built on solid rock, began to feel like it was built on the shifting sands of his weakness. The beautiful past was still there, but it was now haunted by the first shadows of the devastating future that awaited her. The 2 years of fragile peace, of love existing in defiance of disapproval, came to an abrupt end. It was as if a switch had been flipped in Eleanor Vance's mind. Her subtle manipulations and quiet condescension were put aside, replaced by a single-minded, relentless obsession, the conception of a Vance heir. The subject was inescapable. At Sunday brunches, Eleanor would pointedly coo over the children of family friends, sighing dramatically about the emptiness of the Vance nursery. During business dinners, she would toast to the continuation of legacies, her cold eyes finding Amelia's across the table, the meaning unmistakable. She left pamphlets for fertility clinics on Amelia's nightstand and spoke loudly on the phone to her friends about the ticking of a woman's biological clock. Every word was a meticulously sharpened dart, aimed directly at Amelia's growing sense of inadequacy. What was once a home began to feel like a prison, and what was once a marriage began to feel like a performance review, a review in which Amelia was consistently failing. Thomas, caught in the middle, grew increasingly weary. His promises of being a wall to protect her had crumbled. Now, he was a man desperately trying to plaster over the cracks. "Just try to understand her perspective," he'd plead. "The family legacy means everything to her." He no longer saw it as an attack on his wife, but as a problem to be managed, an objective to be met. The final phase of Eleanor's plan began when she insisted they see a specialist. Not just any specialist, but Dr. Roberts, a man she referred to as an old family friend, and the absolute best in his field. His office was a reflection of the Vance world, sterile, expensive, and intimidating. Dr. Roberts was polished and smooth, his voice a soothing baritone that did little to calm the frantic beating of Amelia's heart. From the very first consultation, it was clear that this was not an investigation into a couple's fertility, but an inquisition into Amelia's body. The questions were all for her. The examinations were all for her. She was subjected to a battery of invasive, humiliating tests, her life reduced to charts and hormone levels. When Amelia timidly suggested that perhaps they should investigate Thomas's health as well, Dr. Roberts waved it off with a patronizing smile. "Standard procedure is to explore the most likely avenues first," he said, sharing a knowing glance with Eleanor, who had insisted on attending every appointment. "We'll get to Mr. Vance if necessary, but in my experience, it rarely island." In that cold clinical room, under the watchful eye of her mother-in-law, Amelia had never felt more alone. Thomas was present physically, but his spirit had retreated. He would hold her hand limply, his gaze distant, his discomfort palpable. He hated the cold science of it all, the way it stripped the romance from their lives, and he began to resent Amelia as the source of this discomfort, rather than Eleanor as the cause of the pressure. The process dragged on for months, a slow, agonizing erosion of Amelia's spirit and her marriage. The intimacy she and Thomas once shared evaporated, replaced by a scheduled, mechanical effort to conceive that was devoid of love or passion. It was a duty, a chore, another item on Eleanor's agenda. The distance between them grew into a chasm. The final appointment with Dr. Roberts felt like a sentencing. Amelia, Thomas, and Eleanor sat in his imposing office, the air thick with unspoken dread. The doctor entered, his face a mask of professional sympathy. He sat behind his large desk, folded his hands, and looked directly at Amelia. "I'm afraid the results are conclusive," he began, his tone grave. "Amelia, you have a condition we call premature ovarian failure. In layman's terms, your ovaries are no longer functioning as they should. The chances of a natural conception are statistically insignificant." The medical jargon washed over Amelia, but the meaning was brutally clear. Defective, barren, a failure. She felt the blood drain from her face. It was a diagnosis, but it felt like an accusation. She looked at Thomas, her eyes screaming for him to reach for her, to tell her it didn't matter, that he loved her, not her ability to have children. But Thomas was not looking at his wife. He was looking at his mother. And in Eleanor's eyes, there was not a flicker of sympathy. There was only the cold, hard glint of triumph. Her plan had worked. Dr. Roberts continued to speak, mentioning long-shot options like donor eggs and experimental treatments, each suggestion another twist of the knife, another way to emphasize her brokenness. But Amelia heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the space between her and her husband. The man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health was now looking at her as if she were a broken piece of machinery, a failed investment. The trust she had placed in him, the very bedrock of their life together, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In that moment, she understood. This was never about having a baby. It was about her not being good enough, and her husband, the man she loved more than life itself, silently agreed. The car ride home from Dr. Roberts' office was a journey through a vacuum. No words were spoken, none were needed. The silence itself was thick with meaning, layered with Amelia's suffocating grief, Thomas's hollow shame, and Eleanor's palpable, triumphant satisfaction. Amelia stared out the window, watching the world blur past, feeling completely detached from it, as if she were encased in glass. She had received a medical diagnosis, but it felt like a verdict on her soul, a judgment handed down by a court she never knew she was on trial in. And the man beside her, her husband, had not acted as her counsel or her comfort, but as a silent member of the jury that had condemned her. The estate, once a place of intimidating grandeur that she had slowly learned to call home, now felt like a mausoleum. The warmth had been leached from its walls, the love from its rooms. That night, they slept in the same bed for the last time, a vast, cold expanse of linen separating two strangers. The chasm that had been growing between them was now an uncrossable canyon. The execution of Eleanor's plan was as swift as it was merciless. 2 days later, she summoned Amelia to the library, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and suffocating family history. A portrait of Thomas's grandfather, the founder of Vance Corp., stared down from above the fireplace with cold, judgmental eyes. Thomas was already there, standing by the window, his back to the room. He looked like a child awaiting punishment. Eleanor was seated behind a large, imposing desk, a queen on her throne. She gestured for Amelia to sit, a commander addressing a subordinate. "Amelia," she began, her voice calm and businesslike, "we find ourselves at an unfortunate impasse. The primary purpose of a union, within a family like ours, is continuation. It is about legacy, about ensuring that what we have built is passed down through the generations." She paused, letting the cruel weight of her words settle in the room. "Thomas is my only son. The Vance bloodline, the future of this company, rests on his shoulders. A future you, through no fault of your own, I suppose, cannot be a part of." Amelia felt a cold fury rise within her, a clarity born from the absolute shock of the betrayal. She looked at Thomas, who finally turned from the window, his face a miserable portrait of guilt and weakness. "Thomas," she whispered, a final, desperate plea for the man she had married. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Mother is right, Amelia," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. It's for the good of the family. It's bigger than just us." It was the ultimate coward's excuse, the pathetic justification of a man who had been weighed and measured and found wanting. He was choosing the gilded cage he had always known over the woman he had sworn to love. The scene from that first, terrible night replayed, but now with a dreadful, agonizing clarity. The divorce papers were placed on the desk by Eleanor's lawyer, who had appeared as if from the shadows. The rain lashed against the library windows. Eleanor pushed the papers and a pen towards Amelia. "We have prepared a generous severance for you," she said, as if Amelia were a fired employee. "It will allow you to start over, comfortably." A check was attached, the number of zeros meant to buy her silence and compliance, to put a price on her pain and humiliation. Something inside Amelia snapped. The grief, the shock, the heartbreak, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of pure, unadulterated resolve. The tears she thought would fall simply refused to form. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she detached the check from the papers. She looked at the number, a sum that would have once seemed astronomical, and felt nothing but contempt. She stood up, walked around the desk, and stood before Eleanor. She didn't say a word. She simply held the older woman's icy gaze and slowly, deliberately, tore the check in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces flutter down onto the polished surface of the desk. It was an act of war, declared in utter silence. A gasp escaped Thomas. Eleanor's face, for the first time, registered a flicker of shock, quickly replaced by a tightening of her jaw. Amelia turned and walked out of the library without a backward glance. She went upstairs to the bedroom that was no longer hers and packed a single suitcase. She took only her own clothes, a few books, and a small framed photo of her parents. She left behind the jewelry, the designer clothes, the entire life they had tried to buy for her. Each step she took out of that house was a step toward her own liberation. The household staff watched her go, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. She walked out the massive front doors, into the cleansing rain, and never looked back. As the gates of the Vance estate closed behind her, sealing off her past, a silent vow took root in her heart. It was not a promise of revenge, not yet. It was a promise of survival. a promise to build a life so full, a success so undeniable, that one day the name Amelia would not be a forgotten footnote in their family history, but a towering monument to everything they had been foolish and cruel enough to throw away. The old Amelia had died in that library. A new one, forged in the fires of betrayal, was just beginning to rise. The freedom Amelia felt walking out of the Vance estate was the terrifying, untethered freedom of a freefall. With her old life severed, she didn't just leave a house, she left an entire identity behind. She drove for hours, with no destination in mind, finally ending up in a sprawling, anonymous city hundreds of miles away. She rented a small, bare apartment in a building with peeling paint and strangers for neighbors. The contrast was a physical shock. She had gone from rooms so large they echoed with loneliness to a space so small she could touch both walls at once. The silence here was different, too. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the mansion, but the hollow silence of absolute solitude. For weeks, Amelia existed in a gray fog of grief. She was mourning not just the loss of a husband, but the death of the woman she had been, the trusting, hopeful woman who believed in forever. She was mourning the children she had been told she would never have, a phantom limb of motherhood that ached with a pain deeper than any betrayal. Some days, she couldn't find the energy to get out of bed, the weight of her reality too heavy to bear. The world outside her window seemed to move on a different frequency, one she could no longer tune into. She ignored the worried calls from her parents, ashamed to tell them the full, humiliating truth of why her fairy tale marriage had ended. She was an architect who had meticulously designed her life, only to watch its foundations crumble into dust, leaving her buried in the rubble. The turning point wasn't a dramatic epiphany, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. One afternoon, sitting in a cheap cafe nursing a coffee she couldn't taste, she found herself staring at the building across the street. It was a beautiful old brownstone, but it had been renovated poorly, its classic facade ruined by cheap, modern windows that were completely out of sync with its character. Without thinking, her fingers began to move. She grabbed a napkin and the pen from her purse, and her hand, with a muscle memory that transcended her grief, began to sketch. She redesigned the window frames, adjusted the proportions, and added details that would honor the building's history while improving its function. For 10 minutes, the fog in her mind lifted. There was no pain, no Thomas, no Eleanor. There was only the clean, logical satisfaction of a problem being solved, of beauty being restored. It was the first time in months she had felt like herself. That small act of creation was a flicker of light in the profound darkness. It was a reminder that while they had taken her name and her home, they hadn't taken her talent. That was hers alone. That night, for the first time, she opened the laptop she'd brought with her. She started looking for work, anything to occupy her mind and pay her rent. She began by taking on small, thankless freelance jobs, online drafting blueprints for suburban home extensions, correcting errors in other architects' plans. The pay was minimal, but the work was a lifeline. Each line she drew, each calculation she made, was a small act of rebuilding her own internal structure. It was therapy. It was a way to channel her suffocating rage and pain into something productive, something tangible. Her focus, once shattered, began to return. She worked with a quiet, desperate ferocity, pouring all the energy she once dedicated to her marriage into her craft. Her reputation for being fast, meticulous, and brilliant began to grow in the anonymous world of online architectural forums. An opportunity arose from an unlikely source. A nonprofit organization was looking for an architect to renovate a derelict community center in a low-income neighborhood. The budget was almost non-existent. The building was a wreck, and every established firm had turned the project down. To them, it was a waste of time. To Amelia, it was everything. She took the job and poured her entire being into it. She visited the community, talking to the residents, the children, the elderly people who would use the space. She wasn't just renovating a building, she was reviving the heart of a neighborhood. She designed a space that was not only beautiful and functional, but also sustainable and full of light. She used clever, low-cost materials and innovative designs to create something extraordinary out of almost nothing. She was on site from dawn until dusk, working alongside the builders, earning their respect with her knowledge and her grit. For the first time since her life fell apart, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't Mrs. Vance, the barren wife. She was Amelia, the architect. The day the community center reopened was the day Amelia was truly reborn. The joy on the faces of the children, the gratitude in the eyes of the community leaders. It was a validation more profound than any amount of money or status the Vance name could ever offer. That evening, sitting in her small apartment, looking at the photos from the opening ceremony, she made a decision. She would no longer work in the shadows. She filed the paperwork to incorporate her own firm. When it came to choosing a name, there was only one possibility. She typed the words with a steady hand. Phoenix Designs. It was a declaration, a promise to herself. She had been burned to the ground, reduced to ashes by betrayal and cruelty. But from those ashes, she would rise. She would build an empire, not of brick and stone, but of her own resilience, talent, and unbreakable will. 5 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for scars to fade into faint, silvery lines, for grief to transmute into strength, and for empires to begin their slow, inexorable decay. In the 5 years since Amelia walked out of the Vance estate with nothing but a suitcase and a silent vow, the world had shifted on its axis. The name Amelia was no longer a whisper of a memory in the gilded halls of the Vance family. It was a name spoken with reverence in the boardrooms and architectural forums of the entire country. Phoenix Designs had not just risen from the ashes, it had soared. It was no longer a one-woman startup fueled by pain and coffee, but a powerhouse firm at the forefront of modern architecture. The firm became synonymous with daring, sustainable design, winning prestigious awards for projects that reshaped city skylines. Amelia's masterpiece was the Helios Tower, a gleaming skyscraper that was as much a vertical ecosystem as it was an office building, a testament to her vision of a future where nature and structure could coexist. Her face, once pale with heartbreak, was now the confident, serene face on the cover of Architectural Digest and Forbes. She was no longer the discarded wife. She was Amelia, the creator, the CEO, a queen who had built her own kingdom from the ground up on a foundation of her own talent and unbreakable will. The woman herself had been remade. The soft, accommodating nature was still there, but it was now shielded by a layer of polished, unshakable poise. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had faced the worst and had not only survived, but thrived. While Amelia's star ascended, a slow rot was beginning to fester within the House of Vance. As promised, Thomas had married Isabel de la Cruz, the daughter of a rival real estate magnate, in a union that was less a marriage and more a corporate merger. Isabel was everything Eleanor had claimed to want for her son. She came from old money, her name carried weight, and she looked perfect in society photographs. She was also shallow, self-absorbed, and utterly devoid of any genuine affection for Thomas. Their marriage was a hollow performance. Dinners at the Vance estate, once stiff but formal, were now exercises in quiet desperation. Thomas, increasingly stressed by the pressures of the company, would stare blankly at his plate. Isabel would be absorbed in her phone, cataloging her latest purchases from Parisian boutiques and complaining about the incompetence of the domestic staff. Eleanor, who had orchestrated this perfect union, was forced to sit at the head of the table and preside over the miserable silence. The grand prize she had so cruelly fought for had turned out to be a booby prize. And then came the cruelest irony. A piece of cosmic justice so perfect it was almost poetic. After 2 years of their own joyless, mechanical attempts to produce an heir, it was revealed that Isabel was the one who was infertile. A rare, untreatable condition meant that she would never conceive a child. The Vance bloodline, the sacred legacy for which Eleanor had destroyed Amelia's life and her son's happiness, had hit a dead end once again, this time a permanent one. Eleanor's grand, strategic sacrifice had been for nothing. Her obsession had led her to ruin the one woman who might have given her a grandchild in favor of a barren socialite who was now bleeding the family fortune dry with her extravagant lifestyle. The news shattered the already fragile peace within the family, leading to bitter, whispered arguments that echoed through the mansion. Meanwhile, Vance Corp, once a titan of the industry, was faltering. Under Thomas's weak and distracted leadership, the company had grown stagnant. He lacked the vision and courage to innovate, and his new father-in-law had pressured him into a series of disastrous, high-risk real estate ventures that had failed spectacularly, leaving the company heavily in debt. The foundation of the Vance empire, once thought to be solid granite, was revealing itself to be crumbling sandstone. The signs were small at first: a project delayed, a dividend cut, a hushed rumor on Wall Street, but the cracks were spreading. One evening, Amelia was in her penthouse office atop the Helios Tower, reviewing plans for a new city library. An assistant left the evening's financial news on her desk. As she glanced at the headlines, one small article caught her eye. Vance Corp stocks tumble amidst rumors of financial instability. She read the short article, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph, no flicker of satisfaction. There was only a quiet, contemplative stillness. She placed the paper aside, picked up her pen, and with a steady hand, went back to designing the future, leaving the ghosts of her past to fester in the decaying empire they had fought so desperately to protect. The worlds that had so violently split apart 5 years ago were, ever so slowly, beginning to drift onto a collision course. The news article about Vance Corp's decline was not a spark of joy for Amelia. It was the turning of a key in a long-locked room in her mind. For 5 years, she had meticulously built a new life, constructing walls of success and purpose around the hollow space of her past. She had accepted the story she was told, the narrative of her own failure, and had moved on. But seeing their name linked with instability stirred the dormant question that had haunted her quietest moments. Was it true? The doubt, once a whisper, now grew into a persistent, rational inquiry. She was no longer a powerless, heartbroken girl. She was a woman of immense resources and influence. She could afford to find the truth, and she realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that she could no longer afford not to. This was not about reopening an old wound, it was about closing it, for good, on her own terms. The next day, Amelia made a call. She didn't seek out a common private eye. She leveraged her network to find the best corporate investigator in the country, a man named Julian Croft. Known for his discretion and his uncanny ability to unearth secrets buried under decades of legal and financial bedrock. In her sterile, minimalist boardroom, she laid out the facts of her case, her voice even and detached, as if discussing a problematic clause in a construction contract. She wanted him to investigate Dr. Roberts and the circumstances of her diagnosis. Croft, a quiet man with intelligent eyes, listened without interruption, made a few notes, and simply said, "I'll be in touch." Croft began with Dr. Roberts. He didn't look for personal indiscretions. He followed the money. His team of forensic accountants sliced through years of financial records, cross-referencing shell corporations and offshore accounts. It took less than 2 weeks to find it. A wire transfer for $250,000, paid from a subsidiary of a Vance Corp real estate holding a company with a name so obscure it was virtually untraceable to a private investment account owned by Dr. Roberts. The date of the transfer was exactly 1 week after Amelia's final, devastating appointment. It was the smoking gun, the cold, hard proof of a conspiracy. But Croft knew that numbers on a page were not enough. He dug into the doctor's professional history and found a faint trail of breadcrumbs. A nurse, a woman named Clara Bellwether, who had been abruptly dismissed from Roberts's practice shortly after Amelia's case. Finding her took another week. She was now retired, living a quiet life in a different state. Initially, she was terrified, refusing to speak about her time at the clinic. But Croft was persistent and persuasive. He appealed not to her anger, but to her conscience. Finally, over a secure line, she told her story. She remembered Amelia. She remembered Eleanor Vance's constant presence, and she recounted overhearing a heated, whispered argument in the doctor's office, where Eleanor had said, "The results need to be conclusive, whatever it takes. Your debts will be forgotten." Clara had been fired for a fabricated clerical error 2 days later. She knew it was because she had heard too much. This information alone would have been a monumental victory, a validation of Amelia's deepest pain. But Julian Croft was nothing if not thorough. To fully trace the payment from the Vance Shell Company, his team had to map out Eleanor Vance's complex financial architecture. In doing so, they stumbled upon an anomaly, a heavily shielded, multi-generational trust established by Eleanor's father. Its expenditures were almost entirely sealed. But one recurring annual payment stood out, a substantial sum made out to a long-defunct charitable organization. The name of the charity was innocuous, the St. Jude's Foundling Home. Croft's curiosity was piqued. Why would Eleanor Vance be making legacy payments to a defunct adoption agency? He pulled on that thread, and an entire, hidden world unraveled. It required getting court orders to unseal decades-old records, a feat only possible with the kind of legal firepower Amelia now commanded. And there, buried under layers of dust and legal sealant, was the truth. Hospital records from over 30 years ago showed that Eleanor and her husband had a son, William Vance III, who died from a severe respiratory infection just 48 hours after his birth. 1 month later, sealed adoption records documented a private arrangement. An infant boy, born to an anonymous single mother and given the name Thomas, was adopted by the Vances. The entire Vance legacy, the sacred bloodline that Eleanor preached with the fervor of a zealot, was built on the foundation of a devastating secret and a profound lie. Julian Croft presented his findings to Amelia in the same boardroom where she had hired him. He laid out 2 folders on the vast, empty table. The first contained the proof of Dr. Roberts's bribery and the nurse's testimony. Amelia absorbed this information with a cold, grim nod. It was what she had suspected. It was ugly and vile, but it made sense. Then, Croft pushed the second folder forward. "There is something else," he said. "Something I believe changes the context of everything." He explained, methodically, what he had found. He showed her the infant's death certificate. He showed her the adoption papers bearing Eleanor and her husband's signatures. Amelia listened, her face an unreadable mask of composure. But inside, a seismic shift was occurring. The first revelation had been about her pain. It was personal. This second revelation was about Eleanor's entire existence. Her cruelty, her obsession, her ambition, it was all a desperate, pathological attempt to protect a lie. The fury that rose in Amelia was not hot and explosive, but cold, dense, and absolute. The vague notion of justice she had entertained now crystallized into a concrete and terrible purpose. She had been cast out for failing to provide an heir to a bloodline that didn't even exist. Eleanor hadn't just wronged her, she had built her entire world on a fraudulent premise. And Amelia now possessed the truth that could demolish it, brick by fraudulent brick. She looked up from the documents, her eyes clear and focused. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice steady. "You've given me everything I need." While Amelia held the keys to the Vance family's hidden history, the family itself was sliding towards a much more public and humiliating demise. The financial instability that had been a whispered rumor was now a front-page headline. The disastrous real estate ventures, championed by Thomas and his father-in-law, had become a catastrophic drain on Vance Corp's resources, leaving them teetering on the precipice of bankruptcy. Creditors were circling like vultures, and the company's stock was worthless. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had spent her entire life cultivating an image of unassailable power and prestige, was facing the very real prospect of losing everything. In the midst of this darkness, a single, blinding ray of hope appeared: the City Gateway Project. It was the largest urban renewal project in the city's history, a multi-billion-dollar development to transform a derelict industrial waterfront into a futuristic hub of commerce, residence, and green space. For the dying Vance Corp, this wasn't just an opportunity, it was a defibrillator. Winning the primary construction contract was their only chance of survival. Thomas and Eleanor pored over the city's proposal, their desperation palpable. But as they read the fine print, a single, insurmountable obstacle emerged. The city commission, eager to create a landmark for the new century, had stipulated that the winning bid must be led by an architectural firm with a proven track record in visionary, large-scale, sustainable design. They had even listed a few preferred partners as examples of the caliber they expected. At the very top of that list, In bold, elegant font was the name Phoenix Designs. The silence in the grand, suffocating library was absolute. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, it was almost a physical presence in the room. They were standing in the very spot where they had informed Amelia she was not fit to be a part of their legacy, and now that same woman held the only key to preserving it. Her talent, the very thing Eleanor had once dismissed as a quaint little career, was now the most valuable commodity in their world. Thomas sank into a chair, his face ashen. "It's over," he whispered. "She'll never work with us. Not after what we did." But Eleanor Vance was not a woman who surrendered. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. Her pride, a monolithic force for her entire life, was now at war with her instinct for survival. For a long, tense moment, the battle raged within her. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, survival won. "Get me her number," she said, her voice a low, gravelly command. "Not the public office line. I need her direct line." It was a testament to her remaining influence that within the hour, she had it. She rehearsed her opening line, schooling her features into a mask of warm matriarchal concern, a role she hadn't played in years and had never truly felt. The call connected. "Amelia, my dear, is that you?" Eleanor began, her voice dripping with a thick, cloying sweetness that made her own stomach turn. "It's Eleanor Vance. I know it has been far, far too long." On the other end of the line, in a sun-drenched corner office overlooking the city, Amelia paused, a faint, unreadable smile touching her lips. She had been waiting for this call for 5 years. "Mrs. Vance," she replied, her voice perfectly calm, professional, and as cool as polished marble. "This is a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" The use of the formal Mrs. Vance was a deliberate, surgical strike. It instantly established a new dynamic, erasing any illusion of their past familiarity. Eleanor faltered for a second, the fake warmth in her voice cracking. "Oh, my dear, so formal," she stammered, trying to recover. "I was just thinking about you the other day, wondering how you were." Amelia let the lie hang in the air for a moment before cutting through it with cool precision. "I'm very well, thank you. But I imagine you aren't calling for a social catch-up. My time is rather valuable." Thrown completely off balance by Amelia's refusal to play along, Eleanor was forced to abandon her manipulative prelude. She awkwardly, humiliatingly, explained the situation with the City Gateway project and the position Vance Corp was in. She tried to frame it as a mutually beneficial opportunity, a merging of their great talents. Amelia listened patiently, without interruption, letting Eleanor expose her own desperation. When she had finished, there was a long pause. "I see," Amelia said finally. "It sounds like a significant undertaking." "It is," Eleanor said, a hopeful tremor in her voice. "With your design and our construction expertise, we could be unstoppable, just like old times." Amelia ignored the sentimental bait. "My firm receives dozens of partnership proposals a week, Mrs. Vance. Have your office send a formal brief to my acquisitions team. If it has merit, we will review it." It was a brutal, dismissive power play, reducing Eleanor to the level of any other hopeful applicant. Desperate, Eleanor pushed. Of course, but I was hoping we could meet in person. To discuss the possibilities. My schedule is booked for the next month," Amelia said coolly, letting the silence stretch. Just as Eleanor was about to beg, Amelia offered a sliver of hope. "However, I may have a cancellation tomorrow afternoon. 2 p.m., my office. Be on time." She didn't wait for a confirmation. She simply hung up. Eleanor stood in the library, the dead phone in her hand, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. She, Eleanor Vance, had been summoned. Tomorrow, she and her son would walk into the glass and steel tower that Amelia had built, not as conquerors, but as beggars, praying for mercy from the queen they had once so casually dethroned. The headquarters of Phoenix Designs was not a building, it was a statement. A gleaming tower of glass and ethically sourced steel, it was a monument to the future, a stark contrast to the dark, heavy wood and inherited portraits that defined the Vance world. As Eleanor and Thomas stepped into the lobby, They were immediately disarmed. The space was flooded with natural light. A living wall of green foliage climbed towards the ceiling, and the air buzzed with the quiet, confident energy of young, brilliant minds at work. This was a world Amelia had built, a world that was thriving, innovative, and utterly alien to them. They, who had always been the ones to summon others, were now the ones being escorted through unfamiliar territory. Feeling their own power diminish with every ascending floor in the silent, high-speed elevator. Amelia's office was at the very top, a corner suite with panoramic, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city. When they entered, Amelia was not behind her desk. She stood by the window, silhouetted against the sky, her posture one of relaxed command. She turned, and the woman they faced was a stranger. The last time they had seen her, she was a broken girl fleeing into the rain. This woman was composed, her simple, elegant dress speaking more of power than any of Eleanor's jewels, her gaze clear and direct. "Mrs. Vance, Thomas," she said, her voice even, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The gesture was polite, but the command was absolute. They were guests in her kingdom. They sat on a low, modern sofa, feeling like misbehaving students in a principal's office. Thomas, prodded by a sharp glance from his mother, began their clumsy, rehearsed pitch. He spoke of the Gateway Project's importance, of Vance Corp's long history in construction, of the potential for a synergistic partnership. His voice was hollow, lacking conviction, the words of a man reciting a script he didn't believe in. Amelia listened with an unnerving stillness, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression one of polite, professional interest. When Thomas finally trailed off into an awkward silence, she let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her tone coolly analytical. "I've reviewed the preliminary brief your office sent over. I've also reviewed Vance Corporation's current financial standing." She picked up a tablet from the table beside her, though she never glanced at it. "You are leveraged to the point of insolvency. You have a string of recent, high-profile project failures, and your credit rating is, to put it mildly, toxic." From a purely business perspective, she concluded, looking directly at Eleanor, "Partnering with you would not be a strategic alliance. It would be an act of charity, and a foolish one at that. Phoenix Designs does not tether itself to sinking ships. I'm sorry, but the answer is no." The rejection was so swift, so logical, so devoid of personal animosity, that it was more brutal than any angry tirade could have been. Thomas deflated completely, a man resigned to his fate. But Eleanor was not done. Her business approach had failed, so she pivoted to her last remaining weapon: emotional manipulation. "Amelia," she began, her voice suddenly soft and trembling, "I understand. We have made mistakes. But surely you remember the good years. Surely you remember being part of our family." Amelia's expression did not change. "The only thing I am required to remember, Mrs. Vance, is my fiduciary duty to my company and its shareholders." The coldness of the response finally broke something in Eleanor. The carefully constructed dam of her pride, which had been cracking all morning, now burst completely. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, Amelia saw the terrified old woman beneath the ruthless matriarch. In a move that shocked even Thomas, Eleanor slid from the sofa and onto the plush, expensive rug, her knees making a soft thud on the floor. She, Eleanor Vance, the woman who had demanded the world bend to her will, was kneeling. Tears, real or fabricated Amelia couldn't tell, streamed down her face. "Please, Amelia," she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand forward. "I am begging you, not for the company, for the family name, for Thomas. He has lost so much. Without the company, he is nothing." The performance was absolute, a desperate, final gambit. "I was wrong," Eleanor cried. "I was cruel, and I was wrong. Let me make it right. Come back to us. Come back to Thomas. Marry him again. We'll give you anything, everything. Just save us." Thomas stared, horrified and speechless at the sight of his indomitable mother groveling on the floor. Amelia, however, watched the display with a strange, clinical detachment. She was not moved by the tears or the pleas. She was simply observing the complete and total surrender of her former tormentor. She let Eleanor's sobs subside into ragged, desperate breaths in the quiet of the office. Then, after a long, drawn-out moment, she finally spoke, her voice as calm and quiet as it had been all afternoon. "Get up, Eleanor," she said, without a trace of pity. Eleanor looked up, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. Amelia stood and walked to the window, her back to them. "Your performance is noted," she said to the glass. "And it has changed one thing." She turned back to face them, her eyes holding them both captive. A flicker of hope ignited in Eleanor's chest. "I will not let Vance Corporation go bankrupt," Amelia said. The relief that washed over Eleanor and Thomas was so profound, it was almost dizzying. But Amelia raised a hand, stopping their gratitude before it could even form. "I will save your company," she repeated, "but it will be done on my terms, and my terms alone. No negotiations." The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat, a lifeline wrapped in chains. They had been thrown a rope, but they were just beginning to realize that the person holding it now had complete and total control over their fate. Amelia's terms were delivered not with the fire of revenge, but with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Her first and only condition for saving Vance Corp was a single emergency meeting of its board of directors. It was to be held the following day, not at her gleaming headquarters, but in their own domain, the formidable, mahogany-paneled boardroom at the heart of the Vance building. It was a room designed to intimidate, to project a century of inherited power and patriarchal dominance. By choosing their home turf, Amelia was making a statement. She was not afraid to walk into the lion's den because she was the one who now held the whip. Eleanor and Thomas, caught in the jaws of her trap, had no choice but to agree. They spent a sleepless night scrambling to assemble the board, a collection of aging, powerful men who had been loyal to the Vance family for decades, men who saw the world through the same lens of old money and entitlement. They arrived the next morning, grumbling about the suddenness of the meeting, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and patriarchal condescension as they waited for the young woman who had demanded their presence. Amelia did not enter the room alone. She was flanked by Julian Croft and a team of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the country. Her team was a vision of modern, ruthless efficiency, a stark contrast to the room's stuffy, cigar-scented history. Amelia herself was the picture of calm authority. She took her place not at the side of the table, but at its head, a seat that had been reserved for the Vance patriarch for generations. The board members bristled at her audacity, but a single, cool glance from Amelia silenced their murmurs. She began without pleasantries. "Good morning, gentlemen. We are here to discuss the imminent bankruptcy of the Vance Corporation and my proposal to prevent it." She let her words hang in the air, enjoying the flicker of shock on the board members' faces, who had not been made aware of the true, dire extent of the situation. "My proposal is not a partnership or a loan," she continued, her voice level and clear. "Phoenix Designs will acquire a 51% controlling stake in this company in exchange for assuming all of its outstanding debts. The purchase price for that controlling stake will be $1. Pandemonium erupted. The men, who had expected to be negotiating a simple contract, were now facing a hostile takeover. They shouted about protocol, about shareholder value, about tradition. Through it all, Eleanor sat, white-knuckled, the architect of her own demise. This was not the deal she had envisioned. "This is an outrage," she finally exclaimed, finding her voice. "This is corporate raiding, not a rescue. The board will never approve this insult." Amelia looked at Eleanor, a flicker of something cold and ancient in her eyes. "Ordinarily, you might be right," she said calmly, "but these are not ordinary circumstances. My terms are severe because of the unethical personal history that exists between myself and this family's leadership." She nodded to her lead attorney. This was the moment. The lights in the boardroom dimmed, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. "Before the board votes," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you should all be aware of the kind of leadership you have been following." What followed was a clinical, brutal dissection of Eleanor's deepest sin. Amelia's lawyer, in a calm, dispassionate voice, presented the evidence. First, The screen showed the intricate web of shell companies and the highlighted wire transfer of $250,000 to Dr. Roberts. Next, a signed and notarized affidavit from Clara Bellwether, the former nurse, appeared on the screen. Her statement read aloud, detailing the conspiracy she had overheard. The final exhibit was the most devastating: a high-definition video deposition from the nurse herself. The elderly woman's face filled the screen, her voice trembling but clear as she recounted the story, looking directly into the camera as if speaking to each man in the room. The boardroom, which had been loud with angry protests, fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The board members were not moral crusaders, but they were sharks who could smell the blood of liability in the water. They stared at Eleanor not with loyalty, but with the dawning horror of men who realized they had tied their fortunes to a reckless, criminal fool. The scandal, if it were to become public, wouldn't just sink the company, it would tarnish their own reputations irrevocably. Their allegiance to the Vance name evaporated in that instant, replaced by the primal instinct of self-preservation. But no one was more shattered than Thomas. He sat beside his mother, staring at the screen, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. He was hearing the undeniable, documented proof of his mother's monstrous betrayal for the first time. She hadn't just been manipulative. She had orchestrated a vile, calculated lie, a lie that had cost him the only woman he had ever truly loved, the only happiness he had ever truly known. A single, silent tear traced a path down his cheek as he looked at the monster he had called his mother. The foundations of his entire life had just been dynamited. As the lights came up, Eleanor was exposed, an old, defeated woman under the harsh glare of the boardroom. The loyalty was gone. Her power was gone. Amelia stood up. "My offer is the only thing that will keep this scandal from the press and the SEC," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The acquisition will bury it under a mountain of corporate restructuring. You will save your reputations, and you will save what's left of this company. The vote is now." It was a checkmate. She had offered them a choice that was no choice at all: face total ruin and public disgrace with Eleanor, or seize the lifeline offered by the woman they had once scorned. The vote was a foregone conclusion. The board members, pragmatic and ruthless men dedicated to self-preservation, began to nod in grim assent. They were ready to sever the limb, to save the body, to sacrifice Eleanor to save themselves. But before the chairman could even call for a motion, Eleanor Vance, with the last ounce of her strength, slammed her hands on the polished mahogany table, the sound cracking through the tense silence like a gunshot. She rose to her feet, her eyes wild, her face a mask of incandescent fury. This was not the whimper of surrender. It was the final, desperate roar of a dying monarch. "No," she hissed, her voice a ragged, venomous thing. "You will not do this. You will not hand over a century of Vance legacy to this nobody." She turned her venomous gaze on Amelia. "You think you've won? You think you can waltz in here with your lawyers and your sordid little stories and take what is ours? What is in our blood?" Thomas, seeing the unhinged look in her eyes, tried to intervene. "Mother, please, sit down," he begged, his voice cracking. "It's over." She shoved his hand away, completely deaf to his plea. She was no longer speaking to the board, or even to Amelia. She was speaking to the ghosts in the room, to the portraits of the Vance men on the walls, justifying a lifetime of cruelty. "Everything I did," she shrieked, her voice rising with hysteria, "I did for this family, for the name, for the purity of the bloodline that built this city. Sometimes, sacrifices must be made. Sometimes, weakness must be cut away, like a cancer, to ensure the line continues, strong and unbroken. That is a sacred duty, a weight none of you could ever comprehend." It was her grand defense, her life's thesis, the singular obsession for which she had sacrificed everything: her morality, her son's happiness, and now, her empire. She stood there, defiant and proud, having laid the entire foundation of her world bare for them to see. And Amelia, with the calm precision of a demolition expert, prepared to press the detonator. "The bloodline," Amelia repeated, her voice cutting through Eleanor's tirade with surgical quietness. "You've mentioned that a number of times. It seems to be the foundation of all your actions." She paused, letting every eye in the room fix upon her. Before this board votes on the future of the Vance name, I agree. I think it's crucial that we all understand exactly what that bloodline island. She gave another almost imperceptible nod to her attorney. The screen behind her, which had been dark, flickered back to life. Eleanor stared at it, a dawning, animal terror in her eyes. The first image that appeared was a scanned, official document, a birth certificate, dated 35 years ago. The name on it was William Vance III. The parents listed were Eleanor and her late husband. A confused murmur went through the room. The second image replaced it. A death certificate for the same infant, dated 2 days later. Cause of death, respiratory failure. The room fell utterly silent. The final document filled the screen. It was a heavily redacted, but clearly official, adoption decree, finalized 1 month after the death of their son. It recorded the private adoption of an unnamed male infant by Mr. and Mrs. Vance. Amelia's lawyer spoke into the void, his voice calm and devastatingly factual. As the records show, Eleanor Vance's biological son, the true heir to the Vance bloodline, passed away shortly after his birth. A month later, a private adoption was arranged. That child, he said, his voice dropping slightly, was named Thomas. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, more destructive than any weapon. The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. The board members stared, their minds struggling to process the sheer, grotesque hypocrisy. Thomas felt the floor give way beneath him. It wasn't just a secret revealed, it was the complete annihilation of his identity. He was not a Vance. The history, the legacy, the name he had been taught to revere, the very name for which he had sacrificed Amelia, none of it was his. He was a replacement, a stand-in, a lie his mother had told the world and, most cruelly, had told him for his entire life. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, he saw not his mother, but a stranger. A monster who had built her life, and his, on a foundation of dust and bones. But the final, killing blow was for Eleanor. Her face, which had been contorted with rage, went completely slack. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. Her life's work, her fanatical devotion to a pure bloodline, her sacred duty, it was all revealed to be a mad, pathetic farce. She had tormented and cast out Amelia for failing to provide an heir to a bloodline that she herself did not possess. The lie she had so carefully guarded for 35 years had been exposed, and with it, her entire reason for being had ceased to exist. She made a small, choking sound, a death rattle of the soul, and collapsed back into her chair, not a queen dethroned, but a hollowed-out shell. The vote was a mere formality, a quiet, unanimous raising of hands that sealed the transfer of power. The Vance empire had fallen. Amelia stood at the head of the table, the new matriarch. She looked past the broken woman and the hollow man who had once held her life in their hands, her gaze fixed on the city skyline beyond the window. The past was settled. Justice had been served, not with fire and fury, but with the cold, undeniable weight of the truth. The fall of a dynasty is rarely a loud, explosive event. More often, it is a quiet, hollow implosion. After the vote, there were no more shouts, no more tears. Eleanor and Thomas Vance walked out of the boardroom that was no longer theirs, moving like ghosts through the empire they had lost. The silence that followed them was more damning than any accusation. In the days that followed, the consequences cascaded with brutal efficiency. Isabel, whose marriage had been a transaction from the start, saw that her asset had become a liability. She filed for divorce within a week, her lawyers picking clean the few remaining scraps of Thomas's personal fortune, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a name that was no longer his own. She vanished from his life as quickly and as meaninglessly as she had entered it. Eleanor retreated to the cavernous, empty mansion, a self-imposed prisoner in the museum of her own lies. She would wander the halls, staring at the portraits of the men whose legacy she had worshipped, a legacy she now knew she had no claim to. She would look at Thomas, the boy she had raised to be a king, and see only the face of a stranger, a constant, living reminder of her ultimate failure. The love she had for him which had always been conditional on his role as the carrier of the bloodline, curdled into a strange mixture of resentment and pity. They were two ghosts, haunting the ruins of a fraudulent kingdom. Thomas, however, could not retreat. He had nowhere to go. He was stripped not only of his wealth and his company, but of his very identity. He was not Thomas Vance. He was not the heir to a great fortune. He was a foundling, a man whose entire life had been a carefully constructed fiction. He drifted for weeks, a man untethered from reality, sleeping on the couches of the few friends who hadn't yet abandoned him. He was haunted by one face, one memory, the only thing in his life that had ever felt real: Amelia. One gray afternoon, driven by a need he didn't fully understand, he found himself standing across the street from the Helios Tower. He didn't go in. Instead, he waited, knowing she sometimes walked in the small, elegant park nearby. He saw her, and his breath caught in his throat. She was laughing, talking on the phone, more beautiful and vibrant than he had ever remembered. He approached her slowly, a beggar approaching a queen. "Amelia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She turned, her smile fading into a look of calm, neutral recognition. She ended her call. "Thomas," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. He had come expecting to be turned away, to be met with anger or hatred, but there was none. There was only a quiet, unnerving peace. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he stammered, the words feeling pitiful and small, "for everything. I was weak. I was a coward. I know that now." Amelia listened, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said simply, "you were." She did not absolve him. She did not comfort him. She only confirmed the truth he already knew. It was in that moment of quiet devastation for Thomas that a small voice cut through the air. "Mommy, I found a ladybug." A little boy, no older than 5, with a head of familiar dark, wavy hair and eyes, the exact shade of Thomas's own, came running towards them, holding out a small, cupped hand. He stopped short when he saw Thomas, looking at the stranger with a child's open curiosity. Amelia's expression softened as she looked at the boy. She knelt and examined the ladybug with feigned seriousness before letting the boy release it. Then she stood up and looked at Thomas, whose face had gone pale, his eyes locked on the child. He couldn't breathe. The resemblance was undeniable. "This is Leo," Amelia said, her voice soft but steady. "My son." Thomas's world, which he thought had no lower depths to fall to, suddenly collapsed into a black hole. "But how?" he whispered. "The diagnosis. Dr. Roberts." Amelia shook her head slightly. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks after I left," she explained calmly. "I chose to raise him on my own, away from the poison of your family. He has my name, he has my life, he has everything he will ever need." The final, perfect, and most tragic irony of the entire saga settled upon Thomas with crushing weight. The heir, the true-born, biological heir to the Vance legacy that Eleanor had schemed for, lied for, and destroyed lives for, had been there all along. He was real, and they had thrown him away, along with the only woman who had ever truly loved them. Thomas looked at the beautiful, happy child who should have been his son, who would now grow up never knowing him, and he finally understood the true cost of his cowardice. He had lost not just a fortune, but a future, a life, a legacy. He had lost everything that mattered. This, then, is the ultimate lesson of their story. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. Because when they finally decide to speak, their words won't just be sounds, they will be a storm that can level an empire. Amelia turned, took her son's hand, and with a final, brief glance at the broken man who was now a ghost from her past, she walked away, into the sunlight of the future she had built for them. Her justice was complete, her debts were settled, and her greatest treasure was the small hand held firmly in her own. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story.